Well, if you'll open up to Philippians, what was read, we have a bit of a different service today than maybe you're used to. We're normally preaching through a book verse by verse, and we've been in Ephesians, and so we're stopping that. And not just because it's New Year's and doing sort of a topical message on that, but a new idea had emerged based on what I'm going to share from other selected scriptures, Philippians being one of them. And that's what this sermon is about. It was shared Wednesday, but I wanted to share it on Sunday to try to include as many as we can so that everyone could be together on this. This was unplanned by me, but I think it's not one of those things that a pastor tries to do where he has this super insightful idea that he came up with on his own. Although it did grow organically, I do think it's rooted in the text. And so I just kind of want to share with you what it is and how it emerged. Like you, living in a world where New Year's is put upon our mind this time of year, and thinking about that, as a Christian, you inevitably have to work out some kind of idea in your mind how you should react to New Year's, celebrate it, not celebrate it, halfway celebrate it, whatever. Even if you don't talk about it, it crosses your mind. And so it was on my mind. And so I started thinking, is there a way for a Christian to think about it, and what way might that be? Or let's say there are several ways, and what is just a way, one way you could think about it. And as I was thinking about it, Paul's letters came to my mind, and his introductions to his letters came to my mind. And the reason they did is, you may know this already, but Paul typically begins his letters with some sort of introductory prayer, which sometimes is just called a prayer of thanksgiving. And it's called that because it's mostly marked by thanksgiving. But it typically has this other side to it. So it's a well-known thing that Paul's prayers have these twofold outline to them. Thanksgiving, which comes first, and then a request section, which comes second. And we read Philippians, and if you have that open in front of you, this one seems to be the one that nicely perforates the best to show you this outline. So here you would maybe say from verse 3 all the way to verse 8, you have the thanksgiving section of his prayer. And then in verse 9, and this I pray, he goes into finish out his request. And so I thought about that, and just about the way Paul's mind works whenever he stops in a segment of the timeline and looks back and looks forward. When he looks back, his mind, when he goes to the past, goes to thankfulness. He goes to looking for things in the past up to this point that he's thankful for, which is an amazing exercise to do. They have an old hymn named after that, count your many blessings, name them one by one. And it doesn't take long when you do that to begin to think back on things that happened this year that could have been worse. There's an old saying that there's nothing so bad that man can't make it worse, or politicians can't make it worse. And so you start thinking of things, they could have been worse. And you typically will work up some thankfulness there and begin to have your mind renewed some, which is an important thing apparently, because later in this book, Paul says in chapter 4 that in everything, make your requests known by prayer and supplication, but he says with thanksgiving. So there is a way to pray that is an unthankful way to pray. And since this is an imperative command, we're kind of being invited here slowly but surely into having our minds renewed on a particular point, which is that we seem to fall into this idea that prayer is a sacred area of life that no one can exhort you on. No one can say that you're praying the wrong way, the right way. And prayer becomes in church this kind of safe space, for lack of a better word, where a non-rebuke space, a non-correction space, the Word of God can't get in there. This is a space where you can just vent things to heaven, no matter how vitriolic they might be, no matter how full of unbelief they might be, and know that no one can address you and encourage you to pray differently, because after all, that's between you and the Lord, and that's your prayer life. And we're seeing here by Paul telling us, when you pray, pray this way, or you've thought of the Lord's Prayer, perhaps it's come to your mind, Lord, teach us to pray. The Bible teaches there's a right and a wrong way to pray. There's such a thing as a sinful prayer. The Proverbs tell us that the prayer, even the prayer of the wicked, is an abomination to the Lord. And he says in Isaiah chapter 1, I wish you would stop praying. So it is not the case that all prayer is acceptable to God. And so we have teaching on prayer. And so Paul we begin to learn from Paul. I think his introductions are a wonderful place for anyone to learn. Maybe you think, well, what do I pray? And that's good. Like kids should be able to ask that question. Well, I don't pray and I don't know, what would I pray? Well, use Paul as an example. He says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So take his prayers and you will learn, well, when you pray, first, thank God for things. So that's one thing you can do. And then after that, what does he do next? Well, he has on his mind certain burdens or areas of lack where there's need. And so he goes into making his request. So Paul's prayer would be consist of thankfulness and then requestfulness, which is a marvelous balancing thing when you think about Christian theology. It tells me that Paul did not view his life lopsided either way, where he didn't view his life in mainly in light of the pessimism of the old creation, you might say, but in the optimism of the new creation. He didn't view his life as mainly under the dark shade of Adam's tree, but the bright light from Christ's tree. But you can have an error even still. You can have what theologians call an over-realized eschatology. And eschatos is just a fancy word for last in Greek. So the doctrine of last things. And the doctrine of last things in the Bible is this idea that there are things that happen in the end. Their time is moving somewhere. And the Messiah's coming is filed under the last things, which is why the author of Hebrews says, God in former times spoke to us by the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. Or Peter says in Acts, this is what was spoken of by the prophet Joel, in the last times, such and such would happen. Or in the parable, and last of all, I will send my Son. They will hear him. So the time that you and I are living in, as Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, you are those upon whom the ends of the ages have come. We are living in the last times, the way the Bible tells time. The Bible tells time like seasons, not by a clock. So John says it is the last hour because many antichrists have come. By this we know it is the last hour. So it was the last hour in the first century AD. We're still living in that time. So we are, how does this relate to being balanced? Well, eschatology is this view that, we just sing about in Christmas, that the Lord is going to come, and as far as the curse is found, he comes to make his blessings flow, and sin will be defeated, and death will be defeated, and all these things will be defeated because, be of good cheer, I've overcome the world, all these wonderful truths. But there are people, Paul talks about in Second Timothy, who had said the resurrection had already taken place. They had an over-realized eschatology. Our prosperity gospel friends, if you think about it, a resurrected body is a quite healed body. Pretty healed. I don't know how much better healed you could be than to be glorified and resurrected. That is a healed body. So it's okay. We do believe the Lord for healing. That's kind of the point of this whole thing, right? It's where it's headed. But however, y'all need to set your clocks back, is the point. So Paul writes to the Corinthians in chapter 4, he says, I wish we could reign with you. You are already kings without us, and you're already reigning without us. We're the scum of the world down here, and y'all are just with honor. So this idea of setting the clock right is important. You can fall into a kind of perfectionism where you think, oh, believers are born again and they're regenerated and they have the power of the Spirit and they walk in victory and, they hardly ever sin again anymore. And that will send you on a trajectory for quite a disappointment, because doctrine is really, Charles Leiter said this years ago, this great illustration, truth about invisible reality. So if we had Liam here and we were going to blindfold him and let Jeremy Poe give him directions, let's say he's standing right here in the center aisle and he says, okay, walk straight 5 steps. Okay, that works pretty well. And then he tells him to turn right, but not where there's a space, and he bumps into reality. So you see, he followed the doctrine that you needed to turn right, but it was a false doctrine. He bumped into reality. It doesn't work. And in that sense, sometimes we take a supercharged view of the word false. It's just a heated up term that we get offended by. But error can be purposeful and accidental, both. And so you can be well-meaning, right, and just be trying to back out of your driveway and hit your child. You can be well-meaning and stick something in the socket and die. So error is error, no matter if you intended it or not. And false teaching hurts, whether the person was sinister and malicious or not. And these ideas that a Christian no longer struggles with sin or struggles with sin at a certain degree, if it doesn't match reality, you'll find yourself just in a lifelong battle of lack of assurance and disappointment in people and dejection, and you can't find a way to live. However, you may be thinking, there's another problem though, isn't there, Jeffrey, which you would call an under-realized eschatology, as like, oh, we're no different than lost people. Christians and lost people are exactly the same. Well, no, they do live different, and it does look like something to be a believer. So, but I'm saying, isn't it amazing that there's all these theology books? Piper said this one time, that there's whole philosophies about good and evil, and is their objective good and evil? And isn't it amazing that a father, by just reading simple verses with his children, like cling to what is good, abhor what is evil, communicates an entire book of philosophy with one verse? There is good, there is evil. The evil is to be abhorred, the good is to be clung to. That's an amazing thing. And same thing here, just by imitating Paul, you see, you get this, like you're thankful. What does that tell us? We don't have an under-realized eschatology. There are good things that have already happened. But we're requestful, there's need. What does that tell us? We're not there yet, and there's still lack. So it's an amazing thing. Just by imitating this in your prayer life, it balances you. So I just started there, and I thought, okay, this is the way Paul thinks about time, so this would apply. So it would be right to look back over the previous year and to think about the things that God did in your life and the lives of others that was good, and to be thankful for them. And then to move from there to your requests, which sometimes we don't do, which I think is why I think the order matters. In the Romans version, he says, first, I thank God for you. And he goes on into why. Because as I said, prayer can become grumbling. And there is a difference between groaning and grumbling. Groaning is trusting the Lord by faith while you're waiting on the promise to come. Grumbling is not trusting the Lord and just being negative, and we're going to die in the wilderness and there's no hope and nothing will ever turn out. Oh, that we had the cucumbers and the leeks in Egypt. And you're the guy who said, the law says, don't even go to church because you'll discourage everyone. Don't go out to battle. Just stay home because you'll melt the hearts of your brethren. So to pray with thanksgiving puts some boundaries on prayer and sanctifies us. If you resolve, I'm not going to pray without thanksgiving, it sanctifies me and renews my mind. And sometimes by the time you get through with your thanksgiving, your requests have changed. Your mind's been renewed. But sometimes they're still there. So I thought, okay, that's the general thought, is that to look backwards and to look forwards, thankfulness, requestfulness. Well, then I thought to myself, these are church-specific prayers, you know? It's sort of like Jesus, by analogy, Jesus to the 7 churches. As I always say, he didn't give the letter to Laodicea to Thyatira or theirs to Laodicea. There was a specificity to it. And so here, notice how specific this is to the Philippians. He says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for you all, in view of your fellowship or your participation in the gospel from the first day until now. If you go to chapter 4, he says, look, there was a time when you guys were the only supporters of me. And y'all more than once sent a gift. So this is specific. He couldn't have said this to anyone else. They were the only ones who gave at that time. So when he says, you're partnering with me, to use Washer's analogy, I'm going down in the well on the rope, you're holding the rope, we're partnering together to reach this goal. Like there was something very specific they had done in his life that he was thankful for. And then there was something very specific that they needed help with. If you look at his prayer, he prays that their love may abound. They may have knowledge and discernment. Why did they need that? In order to approve the things that are excellent. What is that? The things that differ. Well, what is that? Well, as we said when we taught on this verse, the discernment to know the difference not between bad and good, but between good and best. That's what this word means. How had they lost sight of that? Oh, they were divided. Remember Euodia and Syntyche? I urge you to be of the same mind. What does that echo? Chapter 2, the mind of Christ, this humility of mind. They had lost sight of the humility of mind and got focused on other things. And that's what you have to do to divide. You have to focus on organic vegetables and say, I am of the organic vegetables and I'm not. Or, here's this way to handle your marriage, or this way to handle your children, or this way to handle the church. Joe wrote a book on this way to handle the church, and it becomes a point of division because it's something that not every Christian can agree on because it's not explicitly here in the Bible, but you are insisting on it in such a way that you put a rift in the relationship. And that can only happen when you start focusing on something that is not best. So I was thinking about how specific they are. And then I thought, well, that means if Paul wrote us a letter, he would be specific. And that's something to think about. There are certain things that if Paul were here today and he knew us and he wrote us a letter, the letter to the Church of Christ Fellowship, he would be thankful for some things. And I wonder, what would he mention? What would he say? But then he would be requestful for some things, perhaps, like I'm burdened for y'all about this or that. And sometimes it doesn't have to be purely negative. It could just be to excel still more. So then I saw the specificity of it. And then from there, I thought to myself, a third thought, that this is in the Bible. That means these expressions from Paul that he's sharing with them are a means of grace. Now, if you're a young person or someone maybe you say, well, I've heard that means of grace. What is that, Jeffrey? And well, again, theologians and Christians come up with these terms. Means of grace just means something like instrument of grace, medium of grace, tube of grace, if you could think of. And the idea, you just think of a means of water is like a pipe, or a means of electricity is a cord. It's something through which this other thing comes. And the idea being, like, say there's water out here and someone were thirsty. You would say, well, hey, we have a water fountain over here and there's one there and there's a faucet there. I mean, there's a pond if you want to run down there, depending on the need. But if you're looking for drinking water, say here, or here's a bottle. But what if they said, no, I want to drink it from the side of this pulpit? Well, that's not a means of water. You can't get it from there. You have to go to the means of water. And that is what people have in mind when they talk about the means of grace. For example, how does the Lord normally save people? Through the Word. What does Peter say? You were born again through the seed of the Word of God. James says he brought us forth by the word of truth. Paul says faith comes by hearing, and hearing the word of Christ. He tells the Corinthians that God was pleased through the foolish message of preaching to save. Or Jesus says you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So you could go on, but there is no salvation apart from the truth, apart from hearing the truth. So whether the truth comes through a hymn, through a radio program, through a sermon, over a cup of coffee from another believer speaking the truth to you, it always comes through truth, one way or another. And that means the means of salvation is always the truth, hearing the truth. How shall they believe if there's no one who's sent, Paul says. And so that means the gospel is a means of grace of salvation. That means if there's someone who's never heard the gospel, they cannot be saved. That's the logic of sending a missionary. because we believe in the means of grace. God doesn't just zap people out of nowhere and perform an inception while they're asleep and they went to bed an unbeliever and they wake up a believer and they don't even know how. They never even heard of Christ, but they're a believer. That's not how it happens. But after that, the idea of the means of grace don't change. Jesus prays in John 17, sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. So the same faith, and that was the Galatians 3 text read to the children, that brought you in is the same way you keep growing. You begin by grace, you grow by grace. The Word of God is the beginning, and then Peter says, grow in the grace and knowledge. So continue in this Word, long for the Word like pure milk, like babies, so that by it you may grow. That's to believers. So you're born again by the Word, you grow by the Word, you're sanctified by the Word, corrected by the Word, encouraged by the Word. So the Word is a means of grace. They'll go on to list others, things like prayer, the Lord's Supper, fellowship, these various means of grace that God uses. Well, I thought about that because obviously this is in the Word. This would be fellowship. This is an apostle. And this is prayer. This is kind of like a lot of them all mixed together. And this was interesting because if this is a means of grace, what this means is one of the ways I am edified and sanctified is through drinking from this spout right here. And you know what occurred to me? There's not a lot of drinking from this. This is not a book idea, but like it could be one. It's hit me as that significant. For example, let's look at them. Just peruse them for a minute. Here we are in Philippians. Look at verse 7. For it is only right for me to feel this way about you all because I hold you in my heart. When's the last time another believer told you they were praying for you every day and it was only right to do because they hold you in their heart like a little locket on a chain? We would have to answer the number is low, if not zero. Now remember, this is a means of grace. We're struggling, but we're not drinking from the spout. Now, let's look at some other ones. That's Philippians. If you turn to the left, you get to Ephesians. There are 3 of these, by the way. Paul has 13 letters in
chapter 1, verse 2, he goes into this thanksgiving, and he lists three things: bearing in mind your work of faith, your labor of love, your steadfastness of hope. I mean, guys, when is the last time someone said that? They just texted you and said, I just was praying for you this morning and remembering your works of faith, your labors of love, and the steadfastness of your hope. I mean, you have to admit, you would almost say we've not done these verses at all. And remember, they're means of grace, which means we've not got much of the grace out of them at all. It might be why our life looks the way it is. Knowing His love for you, our gospel came to you with power, conviction. You suffered well. And that, of course, makes the turn. That's what they need to keep doing. Same thing for 2 Thessalonians. Let's go on to look at 2 Timothy. This one strikes you. This expression of thanks and then prayer for Timothy. Verse 3, I thank God whom I serve for you, prayers night and day. That one strikes you, just that. Timothy, I pray for you in the morning, and then I think about you at nighttime too, and I pray for you. Longing to see you, even as I recall your tears, so that I may be filled with joy. Again, I ask this question of interview. When's the last time you had a believer tell you that they long to see you so that they may be filled with joy? I mean, we have this view of Paul, and it's right. He was a man's man. He made hymns. He wasn't effeminate, but he was expressive. He was emotional. And this thing that men can't be emotional, it really is a lie. Like, we're emotional about the football game. We're emotional about hunting. You miss the deer. You don't just say, oh, I seem to miss the deer. Like, you react with emotion. And we can show emotion. He says, I'm mindful of the sincere. I mean, just to me, it would floor me that Paul even thought about this many details of my little life. That alone would encourage me. You were thinking about my lineage and who my grandmother was and this and that. Paul thinking of me that way? I mean, I feel like that would encourage me for a couple of years right there. But notice this. Assurance. Notice this. For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and for God's sake, for the gospel's sake, try to get this down. If you don't, it's like Conrad Merle said one time, you don't understand repentance, he said, repent anyway. Like, follow the text whether you understand it or not. What does he say here? Well, I don't know who the elect are, Timothy, so maybe, I don't know. We'll see. I'll look at the fruit and see. I don't know. No, he says, I am sure that it is in you as well. This idea that I can't know that you're a believer is what we were talking about earlier, a false teaching. That hurts people. Because what we learn here is one of the ways that my assurance is built up is by my fellow believers saying it to me. I mean, why else does Peter at the end of his letter say, I'm sending this letter by way of Silvanus, faithful brother, for so regard him? Just think about that. I mean, did Sylvanus say, I don't need you to tell me I'm a believer, Peter. I don't really care what you think. Well, that could not have been how they were operating. Of course he cared what he thought. And it increased his encouragement and increased his sense of assurance and faith that the other believer, of course it matters what other believers who know the Lord think of me. I mean, if a true Christian and a group of true Christians come to you and say, we're just struggling in our conscience, we don't even know if you're born again, I would be terrified. If some of you that I know that know the Lord might come to me and say, Jeffrey, we're worried, we don't even know if you know the Lord, I would be terrified. What have I done? What did I do? How could they be thinking this? We discourage each other this way. This is not planned, but I just pastorally have to go here. Just turn to 1 John. I want to show you this. In my opinion, this is the most important verse on assurance in the whole Bible. It's from 1 John 3, in verse 19. He says, we will know by this that we are of the truth and will assure our heart before him. Number one, it's important because we talk about assurance. Here it is. Here's the word John's talking about. And will assure our heart before him in whatever our heart condemns us. So observation number one, Donald Whitney, by the way, has a great book on this, but observation number one he makes here is it's part of the normal ebb and flow of the Christian life to at times doubt your salvation. There's nothing unhealthy about you if you occasionally doubt your salvation. Because you're living in a fallen world where things are not yet perfected. And so what does he say typically happens periodically? Our heart condemns us. But what does he say? But God is greater than our heart and knows all things. This is what it means. If I think I'm lost, that doesn't mean I am. If I think I'm 6'2", that doesn't make it so. My subjectivity does not determine reality. So there's a difference between being lost and thinking lost. They're not equivalent. And this book is written, it tells us in chapter 5, verse 13, to those who believe that you may know. So quite obviously, you're already a believer and you don't yet know. Into this book, you're going to know. So I almost want you, young person, older person, I was just thinking of Thanksgiving, Annabelle, other Mercy, Isaac, Liam was praying. It's not hard to be thankful to start thinking like children have been converted. That's an item to be thankful for. But these young ones, like you're going to feel that there's going to be times you're going to do something wrong, you're just going to think, I'm just a failure, I just let everybody down, I'm not, that this is not for me, and this comes crashing down and your heart condemns you. How do you fix that? You don't go to the world and just like, well, we just don't listen to toxicity and negativity. And, oh, don't beat yourself up. And no, if you sin, you should beat yourself up. You should hate yourself and loathe yourself and be discouraged that you failed God. You should. But that's not how it ends. After the law has crushed you, and to strip you again, and oh, wretched man that I am. So it comes Thanks be to God. But you see, it only comes after, oh, wretched man that I am. So if you never want anyone to feel that, you can never get them, as the old preachers used to say. Trouble's not getting people saved, but getting them lost. So we don't want anyone to stay condemned, and this text proves it, but we would like you to feel it some. Because if you're outside of Christ, you are condemned. And remember, what you think does make it so. The wrath of God abides upon you. The Bible says, whether you think it so or not. If there were an airplane headed for this church building right now to kill us all, the fact that we don't know it's coming doesn't change it's coming. But it works both ways. You can be a believer and doubt your salvation and you still be saved. So look at this. I want you to see this. So go back. How is it fixed then? How is it fixed? How does God's view of me, if he knows I'm really saved, when I'm doubting it, come in and help me? He says, we will know by this that we are of the truth and will assure our heart before him in whatever it condemns us. Well, what's the this? We'll look back at the previous verse. Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. What's that talking about? Previous verse. So the context is, he's saying, don't be like Cain, who was of the evil one and slew his brother, but be like Christ in love. So pick it up in verse 14. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He who does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life in him. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, closes the heart. That means you see your brother, you have the need to build the clothing, like James says, and by brother, I mean a Christian. That's what the least of these is about, Christians. And so you see, in closing the heart, it's an active resistance of the conscience. Okay? I see that this person, but Paul says they are merciless, without mercy in Romans 1, fallen people. He says, closes his heart against him. How does the love of God abide in him? That question. If you're truly a Christian, this is how you feel when you love someone. How could I not? How could I not? How could I live any different? How could I not? It's coming out of you. It's just coming out of you. But your motive here for love, it's not just your love, like Jeffrey's love, or Alex's love, or Jeremy. Just I am a loving person. No, it's called the love of God. How does the love of God abide in me? Well, what's the love of God? We know it by this. So let me tell you the crystal clear difference of someone who has the mind of the Spirit and someone who doesn't. This is the blue M&M that gives it away. Back in my day, they had the blue M&M thing, and you were looking to see your back if you had the blue M&M. That's how you know if you're saved or not. It's not by quantifying, do I have 51% good deeds? And no, that's not the way to think. Think about the outward good deed, but think about it as fruit coming from within. And this is what you think. When you love someone, you say, oh, well, Uncle Joe, he would give anyone the shirt off his back, and he helps these people, and he does this and that. Okay, get Uncle Joe in mind, going down the road to go help an old lady. I want to know what is in Uncle Joe's mind as he's going down the road. If you were to stop him and say, Uncle Joe, you're going to help this old lady? Yes. And you were to say, why? And he would say, well, this is just the way I've been raised. Well, this is the way we ought to behave. And this is the right thing to do. Any other reason, Uncle Joe? Well, son, you need to do right by people, and you need to, that man is lost. You must understand the man is darkened in his mind and lost. Why? We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us. We don't boast about our goodness. We do good things, but why? That they may see the good works and glorify your Father. If you're to say, why are you doing this? And be pressed, but why are you being good? Well, because if you just press, because they're made in the image of God, that would be one reason. And because of the cross of Christ. He loved me and laid down his life for me, so I'm out here. So here's the test. Have you ever genuinely done one good deed? Not from the motive of your conscience, right and wrong, but from the motive of the cross. Because Christ loved you and died for you. That love cascaded into you, and you were therefore motivated to extend it to another person. If it happened one time, you're born again. Because no lost person thinks that way. At all. Ever. That's the mind of the Spirit. They'll lose that. They lose that. And we say, but I did this and I sinned here and I did that and I did. I mean, how else could Jesus tell the guy on the cross, you will be with me in paradise? As Leiter said, there was more real heart righteousness in that one prayer when he said, Lord, remember me when you come to your kingdom. There was more heart righteousness that was real and genuine in that one prayer than all the prayers of all the Pharisees down at the temple combined. Why? Because he meant it. And he loved him. He loved the Lord. Same as Peter. You see, Peter, man, he messed up so bad. But what was he able to say? Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Well, lost people don't think that way. They don't talk that way because they don't think that way. So Paul tells Timothy, I've gotten way off there, but we need to wrap up. Just realize you play a role in other people's assurance. Some of you here have blessed my life in a way that it would be so different without you. You know? And when I think about those things that you've done, if I start thinking about each individual one, I know the motive. Like, I know it was that motive, like from Christ. And it could just be something as simple as that. Like, you're discouraged and you're down, and like, I could tell you, no, like, you've done this and this and this. And remember, that's not always a Matthew 7 thing, like, Lord, did we not, did we not, did we not? Because he's saying, you did. And you're like, when did we? And we could experience something like that with one another. I might be able to tell you right now some things. You're like, Jeffrey, when did we? And I could say, well, here and here and here and here. And you start hearing it and you're encouraged, you realize again, it's true. I did really mean that. And it was from the heart. And that is not how lost people think. And you're re-encouraged in your faith and strengthened again. And so then he goes on to tell him, like, be encouraged, stir this up. He needed to stir up the gift of God in him. I mean, how many times has someone, because they actually care about the truth of the Bible, not just someone saying, I don't even want to think about it, I know that I know. No, but somebody that you know knows the Lord and cares about the Word has said to you, man, you are, if anyone's a Christian, you are. Can you imagine what that does to you? That's what Paul does to Timothy. I am sure that it is in you as well. Well, what I pulled from this in conclusion was this is a means of grace, nearly entirely missing. And the thought occurred to me, what if we heard from one another here? What are the things you're thankful for in this church? And then what are the things that you're requestful for about this church as we look backwards and look forward? And then we allow what is shared from one another's hearts to both edify and encourage us, and also cause us to think about what are things we can do different or more, or brainstorm about some concern and be helpful in some way in the future. So for the next Wednesdays, I'm just going to, I at first thought I would just call people individually and I would just ask them. And I was planning on doing this Wednesday, and then Justin took 45 minutes. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to do that. And then when I called Jeremy Poe, I could tell how encouraged and convicted he was based on what Justin shared. And that's when it really hit me like, this would be a really helpful thing to hear from one another. Here are the things I'm encouraged about when I think about this church. Here are the things that I'm burdened about or concerned, or it doesn't even have to be negative. You may say, just wish you would keep doing X or Y, whatever. And so on Wednesdays, that's what we're going to be doing. Praying, but I'll be sharing from, a handful of believers that I was able to talk to during the week and get their answers on those two areas. So you'll be able to hear what they think and process that and be edified by it and be sanctified. So instead of looking back and looking forward, we can call it listening backwards, listening forwards. So that's what I had to share, and I wanted to take today to do that. So may the Lord be with you and bless you as you go. Press His gospel upon your heart, soul, be with your spirit, and hopefully you're not too busy working or some other providence is an obstacle in the way that you can participate in some of these Wednesdays. And I trust and hope sincerely that it'll be a new, fresh means of grace to all of us and to our precious church here. So with that, I'll close in prayer, and Ryan, then we'll come sing and close the service. Lord, today we're just grateful for your word, which truly continues to be a light to our feet, a lamp to our path in ways that we didn't even know it would be. And Lord, how short did we fall this year and need your gospel again and come up under the grace that has been given to us in the cross and your love that is there to be forgiven and enjoy justification once again. And then from that, Lord, to be encouraged to stretch out and run after this goal here of praying in this way, of being thankful in this way, and requestful in this way, and to listen to the hearts of our brother and sister as they share their encouragements and concerns with us. And as your word says, let all things be done for edification. I pray that this time, Lord, would be edifying and maybe even become a yearly tradition of sorts of just an edifying listen back and listen forward that is good for us and helps us love one another better. In Jesus' name, amen.
If you would please stand, be dismissed.